5. The Atrocity Exhibition. "How are you feeling?" Sandra was asking. "Any better?" Justin Cranley was feeling better now than he had done for weeks. The pain of his madness had gone, the agonizing, endless headaches, the disjointed thoughts, the voices whispering on the edge of his consciousness, all gone, replaced by a clear head, sharp senses, and peace. When he replied, his voice was full of energy and confidence. "Much better," he said, pulling Sandra tighter into a hug and kissing her neck. "It's your influence. You have healing hands, and lips, and thighs. Now we know what to do if I have a relapse." He froze, keeping Sandra's body locked in the embrace, content to feel the shape of her body through her dressing gown. They hadn't done anything as close as this for almost 2 years, and Cranley wanted to savour every second. He moved to kiss her again, but was disturbed by a nagging doubt at the back of his mind. "How about you?" he asked. "How are your eyes?" "They're getting better," Sandra said, her hand movements slowing to a limp halt. "They've been fogging up really badly, but they're clearing again." "Can you see me?" "Well enough," she replied, placing a hand on the side of his face. "I've been thinking," Cranley tried to sound nonchalant, "neither of us are suffering from anything genetic, nothing hereditary. So why don't we try for a baby?" The answer came from her hands. They said yes. She smiled at him, lips curling, eyes hollow and dormant. Slowly, she began to shuck off her dressing gown, baring her shoulders. She hadn't changed in 2 years. Cranley could remember every inch of her body from the last time they had made love, just before he'd begun the downward spiral into madness. The shape of her body, the texture of her skin, the things they'd said together, alone, in the dark. Everything was the same. She was still beautiful. There was a small metal crucifix hanging around her neck by a chain. The shape of the cross lay flat on her chest. An icon. Christ dying for his sins. It was looking at him. "What are you smiling for?" "Ignore me," said the icon. "I'm just hanging around." "Would you like me to take it off?" Sandra's voice seemed distant in contrast to the icon's clarity. Her hands reached for the chain. Cranley's nerve went. He stepped away in alarm. "I'm just going out for a breath of fresh air," he said evenly. "I may be some time." "Don't start without me." Sandra nodded dreamily and whispered something sensual. Cranley flashed a manic grin at her before darting to the door. "It's a crazy thing," he was telling himself. "Just a pre-coital glitch. It's been a long time. You're panicking. Spend 5 minutes wandering around, getting a grip on yourself. Then back here, and get a grip on herself. Okay?" It wasn't okay. He was going mad again. Irrational desire to rush out of the room when you could be riding on the bed with the girl of your dreams and some of your nightmares. That was mad. Once outside, out of Sandra's view, he slumped against the wall and began to shake. He was sweating, breathing heavily, needed to relax, calm down. 5 minutes in the corridor, and he'd be feeling better than ever. The stranger appeared out of the darkness. A short, dark-haired man with a lined, intense face. Devious eyes sparkled in deep sockets beneath a pair of bushy black eyebrows. Dressed in a cream-coloured suit that almost shone. Careering down the passageway without any care for silence or caution, he was the most conspicuous housebreaker Cranley had ever seen. Feeling strength and sanity rushing back to him, he stepped into the path of the intruder. The man ground to a halt, shooting him an unnerving smile. "Hello," he had a distinct Scots accent. "Delighted to meet you at last. You must be—" "Who are you?" Cranley snapped. "What are you doing here?" "Don't you know?" The Scottish voice continued smoothly, rattling off sentences at incredible speed. "A consummate bluffer, this one. I arrived this evening. I'm a guest here and—" He trailed off, confronted by the skepticism in Cranley's eyes. "I'm the doctor. Don't ask for an explanation. You wouldn't believe it." "Cranley?" Another voice, smooth and familiar, came from the passageway behind him. "What's going on? Who is this?" Cranley turned slightly, keeping a wary eye on the intruder. Harry Truman stood further down the passage, wearing an immaculate dinner jacket, the closest thing he had to a uniform. He was laden with expensive video equipment, and Cranley immediately guessed what he had been doing. Trust him to come out unscathed and sane as a housebrick. Not that he could show much with his features hidden by that ugly, leering mask. "Harry, I've just—" Cranley began, before his sanity collapsed. The relapse came without warning. Suddenly his head was screaming at him. An insect buzzing filled his ears, and his vision broke up, fracturing into 1,000, no, infinite pieces. The mask leered at him, laughing, giggling and shrieking and howling like a thing possessed, laughing at him, at his madness. The mask, Truman. Cranley screamed. He launched himself at the man in the dinner jacket, determined to wrench the mask from Truman's face. Put it on the floor and stamp on it. Crush it the same way that Truman had crushed him. Truman was everything. Truman's mask was everything. His enemy at the centre of his world. The doctor slipped from his memory. In the long run, there was only Truman. Cranley smashed against Truman, sending both reeling. Truman was a larger, stronger man, and Cranley simply hadn't the strength to knock him over entirely, but he was tottering, cradling his video camera like a baby. Seeing his enemy defenceless and off balance, Cranley leapt again, lunging at Truman's mask, trying to dig his fingers into the eye sockets, wrench it away, see the real face of the real enemy. Behind them, the doctor slipped away, back towards the stairs. Cranley neither knew nor cared. Ace had seen a small part of the house, but she could tell that it was bloody weird. She'd been scouring the passageways for Bernice, mapping out a floor plan in her head. It would come in useful when she explored some of the lower levels. The problem was that though she knew she was branching out and exploring new ground, it looked as if she was going round in circles. She'd head off down a corridor, which she knew led to a blank in her mental map, only to find herself in a part of the building which she had explored before. She'd wander into a room already searched, which should be on the other side of the house. Finding herself back at the stairwell, she decided to walk in an unbroken straight line until she reached the house wall. She ended up back at the stairs. Well, weird. No wonder Benny was lost. Most of the rooms she'd seen were decorated. Bedrooms, a living room, a study, a cramped bathroom. Proof that this was someone's home. Ace didn't worry about it. So long as she was careful, she wouldn't get caught. And she was careful. This latest room was new to her. It was a nursery, a tiny room crushed into a corner of the house. The room was darkening, evening gloom filtering through a stained glass window that was set high in one wall. The window was covered in a screen of cobwebs, but was still beautiful, its colours undiminished by time. Evidently, the room hadn't been used for years. The furniture was buried under a fine layer of dust. The air was musty and still. Complex cobweb patterns accumulated in the corners. There probably hadn't been any children in this house for a long time. Despite this, the room was preserved. Furniture, toys, books, a cot, and everything. Probably the same as it had been for decades. A mobile hung from the ceiling, its movement clogged by web. A pile of threadbare dolls and teddy bears sat in the cot, glaring at Ace with glass eyeballs. An elegant rocking horse gathered dust in a corner, beside a derelict doll's house. A chart was nailed to the wall. A for apple, B for baby. Kids' stuff. Someone trying to hang on to their past. Ace had hated being a kid, but felt a sudden pang of nostalgia for a less complicated time for something she had lost. Then she felt a shiver of apprehension, as if something terrible and tragic had once happened in this room. Something that couldn't bear being disturbed. The silence was broken by a light giggle, the sound of a young girl playing. It was too perfect, too stilted to be natural. It was like an old, worn tape recording. Disembodied laughter. Ace wheeled slowly, casting around for the sound. The window. It was coming from the window, which was now looking much cleaner than it had done before. The cobwebs were gone, melted away, and the glass was moving. The colours of the glass were swirling in a lazy whirlpool motion, bleeding into each other, forming shapes, figures, landscapes, profiles. The giggling grew louder as the colours began to swirl faster. The effect was hypnotic. Ace watched warily. Suddenly, the colour drained out of the window entirely. The glass darkened, deepened, emptied. The window became black. Ace's features reflected starkly on the dark surface. Ace watched it closely before realizing that nothing more was going to happen. Not yet. Not while she was there. She slipped back into the passage, making a note of the nursery's position on her mental map. She'd be back. There were sculptures in the cellar, 2 vaguely man-shaped figures standing upright in the darkness. Both statues were half-finished, their shells broken with cavities or missing limbs or parts of the head. The lights buzzed around the sculptures, refining their creations. They were making good progress. Bernice had proved an amusing diversion, but it hadn't slowed the sculpting. The structures would be finished within an hour. As they worked, they communed. The occupants of the house, the time travellers, all offered ample variety, but there was a need for flavouring, a disruptive element, a random particle. Yes. Suddenly, Jane Page was lying face down on the ground, her hair filthy with mud and her head groaning with pain. For a moment, she didn't want to move. She wanted to lie still and die. Not an auspicious place to go, but better than in bed. Eventually the pain subsided, and she staggered to her feet. She was surprised by how stiff she felt, as if she hadn't moved for years. And though the headache had gone, there was now an incomprehensible song playing in her head. Maybe when she fell over she'd hit her head and tuned herself into a pirate radio station. She did her best to ignore it, wiping the mud from her hair, and wondering how the hell she had managed to fall over in the first place. She couldn't remember. It was all blank, which was not good. She'd got into a fight in Liechtenstein 6 weeks earlier, been beaten up pretty badly. She'd passed the medical afterwards. But what if this was something long-term? What if she had memory loss for the rest of her life? Her career was screwed. That reminded her. From the look of things, this was the woods around the enemy's house. This path she was on, she remembered, eventually joined up with a lane leading to his front door. She pulled open her trench coat and reached inside, fingers brushing against the reassuring square shape tucked under her shoulder. Good. Should be an easy one. Guy was a cripple, wasn't he? She pulled the shape from its holster in readiness. It was the right weight in her hand. She tightened her coat against the rain and set off, humming an accompaniment to the song in her head. It had begun to repeat itself. The man in grey was shambling up the hill to the woods. From a distance, he would have seemed almost invisible in the deepening darkness. If they were concentrating, watchers might pick out a patch of artificial grey moving against the hillside, but little more than that. In a darkened room at the back of the house, someone was watching the grey man. They stared through cold binocular lenses. Their vision wasn't perfect, but they could see far closer, in greater detail, than would be apparent to the naked eye. The watcher's vigil was interrupted by a voice from the doorway. The creamy tones of Harry Truman. He'd burst into the room without knocking, something he only did rarely. The watcher turned slowly. What was it like? His voice was soft. Boring. Lots of empty white spaces, Truman replied. He tapped at the camera he was cuddling. I doubt the tape's going to be very exciting, sir. I'll watch it anyway. The watcher absorbed the brief account. Leave it on the table. He's back, Truman's employer continued evenly. The man in grey. I've just seen him up on the hill. I wonder what he wants. Truman looked up sharply, as sharp as his mask could convey. I should have told you earlier, he said, voice fluctuating and full of unease. Cranley caught a burglar, then let him go again, he added lamely. When and where? The watcher asked calmly. The cellar, 5 minutes ago. He could be out of the house by now. But he might still be inside, the watcher responded, gliding forward to examine the video equipment. Did he seem violent? He looked as if he'd fall over in a breeze. He's very conspicuous too. Cranley and I'll go after him. Cranley? The watcher frowned. Okay, but be on your guard. He might not look dangerous, but, you know. And keep an eye on Cranley. Truman withdrew. The watcher scrabbled at the video, punching impatiently at the eject button. The cassette hatch swung open smoothly, revealing a melted mess of plastic where the tape should have been. The watcher placed a tentative finger on the shapeless lump, then pulled it back hastily. The remains of the tape were cool but fluid, and a perfect fingerprint was now impressed onto its side. The grey man had reached into the woman's mind and closed off those areas of her memory causing her distress. When she woke, she would forget. The memories would return slowly. They would disturb, but not panic her. He decided against taking her into the house, preferring to leave her sheltered from the rain by the conservatory door. Certain she was safe, he withdrew to his vantage point on the hill. The last time he had approached the house, he had blundered badly. He had allowed his instincts to draw him into the conflict too early. He had wandered in without preparation, without thinking, without any real knowledge of the beings inside. He had gained nothing. This time he would be cautious. He would wait and watch. Something would happen eventually. He had introduced instabilities into the situation which might force a reaction. He frowned and turned away from the house. Something was happening, but it was coming from the woods rather than the house. A shape was moving through the trees. Its path was erratic, but nevertheless it was clearly moving towards the house. The shape was wrong. It didn't belong. It didn't fit into the architecture of the cosmos as it should be. As it moved, the universe jarred around it, like the creatures in the cellar, except that it had physical presence. And where the lights had been negative, this was positive. No, not positive. Neutral, perhaps. The grey man stepped forward to meet it. It looked human. No, it was human. A woman in her mid-20s, dark-haired, wearing a tight black trench coat. Where the man was invisible in the evening gloom, this woman looked like a tear in the fabric of the night. A man raised a hand and called to her. "Stop! You should not—" He got no further. The woman shot him through the head, killing him outright. When his two captors launched into their inexplicable fight, the doctor's initial instinct was to run. Not a clever move, he realized, as he hurtled down the cellar passage. He might have bluffed his way through it. As it was, the house would be on the lookout for him within minutes. The anomaly had gone. The stairs were normal again. The doctor paused for breath, but a glance back down the corridor persuaded him to keep moving. The two men had stopped fighting and were careering after him. They weren't moving very fast, admittedly. The young man was shambling, as if he'd forgotten how his legs worked, while the masked man was laden with video equipment. But they'd catch him if he tarried. He bounded up the stairs back onto the ground floor. His immediate plan was simple. Get out of the house, out of the grounds. Then he could stop and take stock of the situation. There was a door in the scullery, if he could reach there. He turned a corner and almost crashed into a man, the old man he'd seen earlier. He was, as the doctor suspected, a tall man stooping in the low passageway. His features were worn with the passing of time, but his body was still lean and athletic. The aging process had been kind to him. His skin was tanned, contrasting with his neat shock of white hair. He stared at the doctor, eyes reflecting confusion and wariness. "Hello," the doctor rattled before the man had a chance to speak. "I'm the doctor." "Doctor?" The man's face lightened, almost with recognition. He smiled and extended a hand. The doctor took it guardedly. The man had a strong grip. "Wedderburn," he said simply, in a vague London accent. The doctor raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Charles Moore Wedderburn." "Ah, of course, it isn't me you're interested in." "It isn't," the doctor replied, voice neutral. "You are one of Keightley's mob." Wedderburn went off at a conversational tangent. "Up from Cambridge to see how the whiz kid's doing?" "Not much of a kid nowadays." "Not so much of a whiz either." Wedderburn laughed. The doctor felt obliged to join in. "I'm afraid I wandered off," the doctor said, avoiding a total lie. "I seem to have lost myself." "Ah," Wedderburn nodded knowingly. "That's to be expected. One of the side effects. But you'll know all about that." He drew the doctor aside and pointed to the door of what the doctor recognized to be the scullery. "There's a kitchen down there. I'm just locking up, so why don't you pop along and put the kettle on? I won't be a minute." The doctor strolled towards the scullery. A snatched glance over his shoulder proved that Wedderburn really was locking up. He had been accepted as genuine. A genuine what? He wondered. The old man had changed since the doctor saw him last. His movements were easier. When he'd opened the door, he'd been fumbling, his hands shaking. The doctor put it down to age or a muscular complaint. Arthritis, maybe. Wedderburn's smooth movements belied that impression. The kettle was warming up as Wedderburn returned, apparently still convinced of the doctor's integrity. He seemed harmless enough, offering tea and conversation. He could turn out to be a mine of information and maybe an ally. The kettle began to scream. Wedderburn took it off the boil. "Well," he said, "let's talk about Winterdawn." The song wasn't budging, but Paige was learning to live with it. She'd indulged in target practice on her way down, some old tramp nobody would miss, and found that she was still accurate. She'd slipped the gun away as she entered the grounds of the house. There was no point to subtlety. Go through the front door. It loomed before her, a great slab of oak masquerading as a door, decorated in brass. She stabbed the doorbell and was pleased to hear the sound of a simple bell. Nothing tasteless, no tinny attempts to mimic the national anthem. She huddled in the porch, singing to drown out the bloody awful song. "The bells of hell go ting-a-ling-ling for you but not for me." The door was opened by a woman. Mid-20s, Paige estimated. She stared at the newcomer with big, round baby eyes. She was wearing nothing more than a plain dressing gown, showing slightly more cleavage than Paige would have been comfortable with, clearly been thrown on hastily. Paige felt a tingle of satisfaction as she realized she might have interrupted a moment of special intimacy. "Hello?" "Avon calling." Paige punched her smartly across the jaw. The woman crumpled. Paige stepped through the door, across the body. That was the easy part. Now, Winterdawn. Ace was sticking close to the nursery. She wanted to be where the weird stuff was happening. Since she was also supposed to be searching for Benny, she couldn't waste time hanging round for the next bout, or for the doctor to put in an appearance, so she decided to look round the rooms nearby. Fingers crossed, the architecture wasn't about to do another double-take. The first she searched turned out to be a storeroom. No sign of Benny, perhaps, but still interesting. The room was large and undecorated, its walls painted an ugly shade of military grey. Dust was everywhere. The atmosphere wasn't as tight or as heavy here as it had been in the children's room. There were no imposing stained glass windows, just a normal skylight. This was turning black, but only with the onset of night. Furniture, ornaments, and decorations were all hidden under white dust sheets, the exception being a cabinet in the heart of the room. It was an ordinary mahogany box, decorated in a vaguely oriental style. Stylized dragons were etched into the metalwork. It sat smugly, whispering two simple words: valuable antique. Ace threw open the valuable antique, half expecting a blaze of light to emerge and consume her. It failed to materialize. The cabinet was empty. It was just a box, smaller inside than out. Ace lost interest in it and began to inspect the rest of the items on offer. Sheets were pulled away with a flourish, revealing other antiques. Furniture, statuettes, ornaments, stacks of paintings. Ace thought they were nothing special, but hidden amongst the ordinary junk, there were more interesting things. The first was a plant. It didn't seem unusual at first, but gradually it clicked with Ace that it wasn't ordinary. It wasn't a Perivale household plant. It was tropical, buried under a sheet in an unheated room, and it was thriving. It was exotic, even by tropical standards. Its blooms were a riot of colour, purple, yellow, blue, orange, erupting from all angles of the stalk. Its patterns were chaotic and zigzagging, rather than elegant or intricately repetitive. The stalk was thick and twisted, growing upwards in a spiral. There were other plants, but none were identical. Each was unique. There were insects, dead where the plants were alive. They were buried under glass, graves marked by index card epitaphs. The handwriting on the cards was near illegible, but seemed to consist of names, dates, and lists of unique characteristics. No two insects were the same. They were deformed. Nature had been overgenerous to most, bestowing extra wings, limbs, or heads. Others were less fortunate, wingless, legless, or, Ace's skin crawled, headless. Ace almost dropped the display case out of nauseous disgust. There was something worse. A stuffed animal, a rodent. When she first saw it, Ace thought there were two, both mounted on the same stand. But there was just one. It had two bodies, one growing out of the stomach of the other. Ace wanted to get out, an irrational desire. The animal and the insects were dead. In life they would have been harmless, but she still felt sickened. Benny wasn't here, obviously, and the doctor would be fascinated by this stuff. Ace couldn't see any connections yet, but she'd lay odds that the doctor would. She turned towards the door. The antique cabinet burst open without warning. Something emerged, 7 feet tall, alien, something that was simply too big to fit, that hadn't been there when Ace had looked, something thrusting between Ace and the exit. It was a bloody great insect. The fine hairs that covered its body were twitching, its complex mesh of wings folding and unfolding on its back, antennae flailing. It was agitated. Ace's face was reflected 1,000 times in its compound eyes. Ace watched it unfold before her, scrutinizing it with a mixture of revulsion and caution. The creature reared up and lurched towards her. Benny woke to find holes in her memory. She remembered leaving Cranley and his girlfriend to their own devices, crawling into the cellar, then blank. In the cellar there had been something evil, something that should have been etched into her memory. It wasn't. The thoughts had been stolen. She remembered a man in grey she'd met outside the house. She'd collapsed, drifting in and out of consciousness. Snatches of the man's intonations echoed in her skull, meanings eluding her. Now she was safe and well, with half a mind missing, and a headache the size of the Draconian Empire in its place. She was sandwiched into a corner where the wall of the house met a wall of glass, an extension beyond the boundaries of the house. Inside was gloomy, but she made out overgrown vegetation shapes silhouetted against the glass. It was a conservatory, with a door not 2 feet from her. She could get in without going through the cellar. She couldn't face the cellar alone again. She'd find the doctor and Ace. This required a team effort. She got up, opened the glass door, and plunged into the undergrowth. Winterdawn. The doctor found a name that went with the house. Professor Jeremy Winterdawn. Wedderburn implied that he was as famous in scientific circles as C. Moore Wedderburn was in botanical circles. The doctor nodded patiently, sipping his tea. Wedderburn imagined the doctor was a colleague of Winterdawn's, come to check his progress. The doctor waited patiently for further elaboration that never came. Wedderburn assumed that he knew everything already. "How long have you known Professor Winterdawn?" the doctor asked politely, contemplating the unfortunately low level of tea left in his mug. "Since childhood. We were at school together," Wedderburn explained, helping himself to biscuits. "We both ended up in science, physics for him, botany for me. We stayed in touch. It was Winterdawn who persuaded his colleague, your colleague, of course, to fund my American jaunts." "Botanical expeditions?" the doctor questioned. The tea level approached the dregs. "The one true faith. I was an environmental crusader. Partly, I wanted to see the rainforests while they were there. The research element was a part. And publicity," the doctor asked smoothly, "was the main reason." Wedderburn's face lit with enthusiasm. "It worked, too. We made an impact. Not great, but still a hit. That was the serious part of the expeditions. The research was good. It turned up some fascinating uncatalogued species and mutant strains. But the important work was getting people to understand what was happening. It still is now." "You're not angling for a grant, are you?" the doctor asked, getting into the feel of his role. "No," Wedderburn smiled ruefully. He was a compulsive smiler. "I'm too old. I'll be dead when the last tree goes. Hypocrite that I am, I've lost the will to fight." "There are others," the doctor said, encouragingly. Wedderburn nodded, but didn't reply. "I've never actually met Professor Winterdawn. I know him by reputation," the doctor ventured, lying easily. "I've only recently joined Professor Kitely's team, and I don't quite understand why he isn't working at Cambridge." "Well, after the accident—" "Accident? Kitely didn't tell you?" Wedderburn clicked his tongue in mock irritation. "There was an accident 5 years ago. A domestic, a car crash. Jeremy and Jenny were driven off the road by some maniac. She went through the windscreen. He survived, just about. The moment he came out of hospital, he handed over all his research to Kitely and took off, resigned his seat, came back here. It was Jenny's family's house, but she had left it to him." "But he's still working for them, for us." "Kitely, stubborn female that she is, talked him round," Wedderburn explained. "Besides, his private research into the Thascalys theorem uncovered a few things that set his mind racing. He's a freelance, all unofficial. That's why the mailing company was set up." "Mailing company?" the doctor echoed. "Don't you know?" Wedderburn's eyes narrowed, the first signs of suspicion nurturing. "You should. I'm easily confused." "You're a quantum physicist. It's an occupational hazard." The doctor changed the subject before Wedderburn's doubts could grow. "Tell me about some of the others here," he asked. "I saw a man earlier. I didn't have time to catch up with him. Tall, wears a mask, carries a lot of electronic equipment around with him." "That's Harry Truman. More tea?" Wedderburn asked, receiving a nod. "He's a sort of all-purpose resident." Wedderburn's sentence was cut short by a shrill yell from the corridor, a choked expletive turning rapidly into a scream, not of fear, but of pain. The doctor recognized the voice. Bernice Summerfield.